You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our Dinner and Dialogue gathering on February 12th, 2025. Thanks for tuning in. All right, friends. Well, here we are back again talking about the second naïveté, which, if you'll recall with me, is an invitation to a second innocence after encountering the critical struggle with your own life and inherited tradition. You know, it reminds me of this quote that we've talked about before that was attributed to Beethoven on his deathbed, who said his greatest accomplishment in life was not one of his compositions or his symphonies, but that he had made it to the end of his life and that he had learned to look at the world in all of its darkness and still love it. That's what we're after. How can we, as we age, continue to look out at the world through the eyes of a child? Next week, we're going to look at the path of self-acceptance, and then we'll close the series before Lent by looking at how to discover the inner child, asking how do we recover a sense of wonder, awe, and again, love for this hurting world after the difficulties of life. But for a moment, let's retrace tonight where we've been. You know, I love that the author, Hilary McBride, notes something brilliant in her psychological research. She says, if I could sum up all my years of clinical training and research in one statement, it would be this: we heal when we can be with what we feel. And so over the past couple of conversations, we talked about how to deal contemplatively with our thoughts and our feelings. Remember, not labeling any of them as good or bad, but rather learning to welcome them so that we can become conduits for the arising and passing of our inner modes without judgment. McBride goes on to say, if you're willing to pay attention to and dialogue with what's happening inside of you, you'll find that your body already knows the answers about how to live a full, present, connected, and healthy life. And again, this kind of presence is what we're after. You know, have you ever met a calm, compassionate, and wise elder? Isn't it amazing when we run into elder humans who have this wide, spacious, grounded, and welcoming presence? And I'm sure just as many of us have run into embittered, cynical, and closed-off elders, right? Having had these contrasting experiences myself is part of what inspired me to get interested in spirituality. Having known both kinds of folks, I got really curious about, how do I become like those wide, spacious, and welcoming folks? What do I have to tap into to become that? What do I have to know about myself? What do I have to let go of, etc.? And so, the journey continues. Okay, but tonight we are here to talk about reckoning with one of the more difficult aspects of our embodiment, our mortality. I have many vivid memories about my own personal journey with cancer, but one of the ones that stands out the most, and I still think about, is shortly after my diagnosis, I remember kneeling over my couch with my face down in the pillows, weeping, and having these very real flashes of the possibility of my own death. And I was 27 at the time, and was at a point early in my journey with that disease where I didn't, know exactly what the road was going to look like. I didn't know what the prognosis was going to be. And initially, my oncologist had told me that it was a pretty positive outlook, that they felt like they could get the cancer. But then I got to reading on online forums, which is never a good idea. And I read about people who had the same exact diagnosis I did and for whom it didn't go well. And this really did a number on me, I almost remember the lightning bolt in my own mind when the real, imminent possibility of me dying struck. And it took root in my brain and my psyche. And it wasn't something I had really considered up until that point. I was fairly young and able and sort of lived without much concern of death. And boy, did that do a number on me. It's something, and maybe you've had a similar experience in your own way, that when it happens to you, you can't unsee what you saw. I remember shortly after my cancer experience, I had read this novel called The Blood of the Lamb by Peter de Vries. And in it, there's this throwaway line that hit me like a gut punch. He said, "Death is the commonest thing in the universe." And I was like, yeah, that feels true to me. Everything dies, and I couldn't unsee that reality anymore. And while initially it felt like a curse to know this aspect of reality, like many things that happen to us, they can also blossom and bloom into gifts that become our greatest teachers. And the Stoics talk about this idea, memento mori, of remembering your own death. The philosopher Seneca said, "Let us prepare our minds as if we'd come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day. The one who puts the finishing touches on their life each day is never short of time." So the implication of this line of thinking is, of course, not supposed to make us sad, but to rather inspire us to begin to live a more present life now and not wait in order to do so. We have to acknowledge that for some of us, not having had to reflect on our own mortality is a privilege, precisely because we've not been forced by life circumstance or tragedy to have to see things we can't unsee. So for some of us, we're invited to make a choice like the Stoics, not to skirt death and engage it head on. But for others of us, we get forced to deal with this existential level of our embodiment because of our situation, because of what we go through. And yet, either way, the call is the same. I love that Cornel West calls himself a blues man, precisely because he comes from a people group whose story has been dictated by catastrophe and oppression in the Black American experience. And on this, he writes, "In the face of catastrophe, compassion, courage, vision, not hatred, not revenge, is the response. The blues man doesn't allow the catastrophe to have the last word. That love and empathy and justice train is still flowing. Not just because it has a high chance of winning, because it's not about being on the side of winners, but because it's necessary." What a beautiful response to the harrowing reality of unjust death in his own Black experience and tradition. Notice, like Beethoven, he too understands that for violence to be transformed, we can't return death with more death, which is sometimes called the myth of redemptive violence, but instead, death must be transformed by love, courage, and compassion. We have to find a way to look at the world and love it in all of its struggle. So you might be wondering here, Tim, why again are we talking about death and existential dread in a series of conversations on entering the second naivete? Well, because I believe if we're to take our embodiment seriously enough to move toward the second naivete, we have to deal with our fear. And it's been said that all fear is ultimately rooted in the fear of death. It's our job to embody a different posture than the way our dominant culture and its cult of youth does, which is to skirt death at every cost in order to not have to stare it in the face, and instead to move through our fear into loving embrace of the ephemerality of our lives. St. Francis said to welcome death as a sister. And did you know, dear Santa Barbarans, that St. Barbara herself is the patron saint of a happy death? John O'Donohue said that the heroism of the contemplative endeavor is the attempt to reach through to that final threshold and enter that fierce conversation between beauty and death. Within this white shadow, he says, the gentle eyes of beauty can outstare the eyes of death. Below the loss and transience of life is the primal affection, which is love, the divine beauty which holds everything together. So the default way our society often deals with death is to push it away. And to be sure, Untimely deaths or unjust deaths are a great tragedy. There's no sugarcoating or skirting that. But the contemplative invitation is to somehow, right in the midst of the death all around us, to pursue and encounter the mystery of a divine cycle of love that holds everything together in its life and in its passingness. You know, in the wake of my own brush with death, I also started to read something called process theology. And one of my favorite professors and theologians, John Cobb, said this: "Wherever life can come into being, it has a tendency to do so. The universe tilts in the direction of encouraging it." Now think of that quote in the context of the quote I mentioned earlier, that death is the commonest thing in the universe. Death is the commonest thing in the universe, and wherever life can come into being, the universe tilts in the direction of encouraging it. You see, the good dualist in us would want to see it as only one way or the other. But remember, that's the first naivete. The first naivete says either let's focus on death and everything dying and be pessimists about the whole thing, or let's focus only on joy and life and pretend that death isn't happening all around us. But the invitation of the second naivete is thoroughly non-dual. The invitation is to hold both realities together. The universe is actually a cycle of rebirth, regeneration, or what our Christian language would call resurrection. And in this cycle, in this reality, in this actual universe we inhabit, life and death go hand in hand. They are reciprocal. In fact, death brings out the fire and fiber at the heart of life, at the heart of beauty. This cycle is the most natural thing in the universe, and it is nothing to fear. I've even gone as far before as to say that the gospel is, it's good that you're here, and it's okay to die. Imagine if we knew deeply our own goodness. You know, that you really are loved, and deeply loved. And imagine if we could be liberated from the fear of death. Those two things together might be the most powerful recipe for a grounded life. Death, like going on a bear hunt in that children's book, is one of those things you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you can't go around it, you have to go through it. The second naivete includes a fearlessness that arises from remembering your own death. We have to go through it in order to move with deep courage in the world. So, I don't know where each of us are at in our own journeys with existential dread tonight, whether you've thought or dealt seriously with your own mortality and the mortality of others, or if you haven't. And there's no such thing as further along or not far enough along on this, okay? But the invitation for each of us is the same. Consider this beautiful quote from theologian Jack Caputo. "The deep is not something to fear, but to love. The way we love the mother and matrix of us all. The way we love wind and sea and earth. The stuff from which we are formed and into which we return." So my hope and my prayer is that as we learn to love the deep things of life, which includes and transcends death itself, that a resilience and courage and fearlessness might be forged within us that will help us to give ourselves back to the world, give ourselves back to our everyday lives, back to our loved ones, having the irrevocable joy of the eyes of beauty that outstare the eyes of death within us. So let's chat about this. Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.